Welcome to M&A Science Live, where leading M&A practitioners share lessons from their experience. When you use proven techniques in M&A, more value is created. If you're interested in keeping up with the latest from M&A Science, visit mascience.com and subscribe to our newsletter. Again, that's mascience.com. I'm your host, Kisan Patel, CEO and founder of M&A Science and Deal Room. Joining me today is Mike DeVita. Mike is a business value advisor at Salesforce, M&A transformation executive at Salesforce, and he was previously director of M&A integration at Walgreens. Today, we're going to talk about assessing value realization, what it is, how it works, the steps, and common challenges. Mike, if you can kick things off with a brief introduction on your M&A background.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Kisan. I really appreciate the time. Wonderful to be here. Looking forward to it. I just have to start though with, I am extremely jealous of your audio setup. So I'm not an audiophile, but you always sound so smooth, and I'm just getting jealous of your gear. So I want to start by saying that. So well done for any of those who end up watching the video or watch the videos often. Again, my name's Mike DeVita. I've got a couple of decades of background in M&A, working across the deal continuum from LOI signings all the way through full-blown integration. Integration's kind of my sweet spot. I've done this across a myriad of industries. Kisan mentioned healthcare in my work at Walgreens, in technology with Salesforce, one of the roles I've held here with my current employer, and a myriad of other companies, both as an employee and a consultant across consumer goods, manufacturing, distribution, et cetera. So I think that experience across the deal continuum is really helpful when it comes to assessing how to ultimately arrive at value, since, as most folks know, most M&A deals, and depending on the survey, between 70 and 80% fail to achieve that value. So once again, pleased to be here.
Before you were at Salesforce, you used to be in M&A integration at Walgreens. What was your biggest lessons learned over there?
Like most roles, there's always a lot to learn. And that role for me was certainly no exception. I think when I think about the integration hat, which was the hat I wore up until the time I left. The last role I had there, and I've heard this echoed on other podcasts of yours and certainly in the broader M&A community, but integration really needs to start, and folks who are responsible for it to get involved as early as possible. So we have a tendency, and with good reason, to concern ourselves in the early stages with things that are primal in terms of diligence and valuation, et cetera. But we can get into kind of what's some of the problems if that's neglected can lead to. But I also think the tent really needs to be as wide as necessary in order to make sure a deal is successful. So we tend in M&A, for very good reasons, confidentiality reasons, et cetera, to often limit the expertise that we have involved at a given point in time to a small group of individuals. We need to make sure that we're not tied to a number, but tied to a necessary expertise, and build the tent and who's involved in it that way. So it's one of those things that I've felt that kind of lets it is one of the reasons that deals often fail. And then third thing, again, also can get into this, but is to let the deal model guide your decision, not the decision guide your model. And this is probably more relevant in kind of the valuation phase, but I've seen it happen a number of times where someone involved in the decision-making process just has to have an acquisition. And so folks make even things that are supposedly as rigorous as a deal model end up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. where things are catered to make a deal appear a certain way. So those are a few of the things just off the top of my head that probably are among the biggest lessons learned.
To recap, it's essentially the typical make sure you're planning integration early. Uh, I like the point about having the tent sort of wide open so you get the right people involved and thinking about the deal. And then the last one is around essentially like validating the model and knowing when you need to walk away.
Yeah, if you don't know what your walking point is, and it seems fundamental, but as many of us who practice in it know, in many cases egos are involved, and for many other reasons, folks who are very capable of understanding the model don't like what the outcome says it does, and so they sometimes don't follow their better judgment and let other things get in the way of making that deal. The other thing I'd say in terms of that planning, without harping on it too much, it's really more than just having an integration plan. Of course, that's important, but making sure that the plan is adequately represented in the deal model, because in many cases that affects that go no go decision if there are material impacts that are required based upon your ambition. If an ambition is to not integrate something and it's a standalone, maybe you have a portfolio style approach to a given deal, whatever those objectives are, then you probably don't need to worry about that much. But to the extent it's really part of a strategy to leverage current assets in the portfolio, current businesses, and integrated into those, then if that isn't adequately represented, not only in the model, not just planning the task, of course that's important, but representing in the model, then maybe you overpay or do a deal that you otherwise wouldn't.
So that's interesting. So there's got to be a connection between the two, between essentially how you're planning and then validating your model so that you got the right checkpoints in place. And I guess it ties back to that also knowing when you need to walk away from the deal.
Yeah, and let's be realistic about it. Material items related to integration need to be accounted for in that deal model explicitly. There's always tons of things that maybe folks who are involved in a certain part of the business go forward think are important, but that's just simply because of the scope of their role. So it's not every dollar and cent, but it's the big dollars that would otherwise impact the decision that need to be explicitly accounted for, and often aren't, simply because, to that other point, maybe the tent doesn't have everyone who's necessary in it.
That's all these points tie together. Now, I want to open this up a little bit too, just to make sure we got some clarity before we move on.
Yeah.
When we look at some of the like sort of the flip side of where things get wrong, and pretty common, right? We go through the deal and have a lot of assumptions to build out the model. Where do you see the people that often aren't in the tent that should be in the tent that would contribute to not only better planning, but validating that model earlier?
Yeah, I'll categorize it generically to make it more applicable. It's often not the folks who own, let's say, the P&L of an area or areas into which the acquired business or businesses will be integrated. It's often the folks that own operating those businesses. So maybe that level just below, and that exact title and the exact number will vary based upon the composition, the org structure of the acquirer. Like I said before, the nature of the business and how much integration we really want to take place. But it's what I'll call generically an operator persona. So maybe I don't own the whole P&L, and hopefully those folks at that P&L ownership level for recipient businesses of the acquired assets are involved, but they may not be the chief operators within there, especially along critical functions. And so that operator persona at a senior level are really the folks you want to make sure get involved.
Got it. So really key operational folks that essentially going to be managing the actual integration work.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the day to day. So think about the folks who who own um, those functions, operations, the way things are currently organized. Again, it takes some forethought too, because okay, you're going to bring this acquired business in there. Are things going to operate the same? Is it simply a matter of assimilating to the current operations business processes that we have with our existing businesses? If it is, those people should be pretty easy to identify. If it's something different and you're really revamping how you're doing things, the individuals may change. So it's essentially making sure a real good understanding of the integration ambitions, that integration strategy is had. And those folks need to make sure the right people are in the room when it comes to diligence.
Got it. And then what about when you start creating those checkpoints about backing out of the deal or changing directions? What goes into that? Like, how do you actually solidify that? Because I think you have a good point there where a lot of times it isn't defined, and we always use that term deal fever kicks in, and you're sort of more really trying finding every possible way to get the deal done instead of saying, hey, you know what? I think we hit this threshold that we need to call throw in the towel.
Yeah, exactly. I think, look, let's not be Pollyannish about it. It's not easy. Um, I think the timing, meaning up front, we've got to consider what walking away looks like, or maybe on think of it the opposite way, what doing a deal requires. Make sure there's agreement upon that before we get into any of the other specifics. And hopefully, when you're signing a letter of intent, you have that in mind, and it's hopefully discussed and then explicitly documented, even for a small group of folks, what that looks like. Because you do get into that fever. People are working hard. It would be good to have it. And like every person in M&A knows, there's always a deal at the right price. So it's very rare that you say, well, this is a putrid asset. Now, if you get in there and you've got real quality of earnings issues or other issues like that, yes, okay. You're dealing with a situation where you probably want to walk away regardless of what a model tells us. But let's say there is that integrity. It really comes down to making sure you've got um, agreed upon guidelines for what we'll do a deal at and what we won't, and then can stick to that. So it's easier to stick to it when it's already documented, so you're not overtaken by the emotion of it. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the integrity. I mean, if you're a fiduciary, I come from a finance background, so typically you're potentially the bad guy, depending on how you want to look at it. But the person to say, hey, look, unless there are radically different assumptions here, I don't see us realizing enough of the total deal value created versus maybe the seller to make this thing worth our while.
Got it. So probably thinking about this stuff early on about where those points are that you're not going to sacrifice, and almost basically thinking about what are the things that are going to go wrong ahead of time to have that understanding and clarity in terms of what are
I
going
mean, it's not even all the things. I mean, it's nice to do that, but I mean, the first time that's accurately forecasted in every way, shape, or form, or the next time will probably be the first. It's more about how that translates into numbers. So, at X, all the circumstances, those foreseen and unforeseen, end up with us here rather than a higher number. Then, it can't be done.
got it. That makes sense. So that gives you your cutoff point.
Yep.
Is when you're not going to really
And that's objective, right?
Yeah.
So even though there's some circumstances you anticipated and some you didn't, and some have a financial impact that you either under or overestimated, it all comes out in the wash. Because otherwise, what can often happen is you then start to tweak the synergies. Well, yeah, I can get more out of that than this. That puts so much pressure on the back end integration. And if you have a small tenant, hate to keep going back to that. And if you're just moving on to the next deal, you're not as accountable. You're not there for the next couple of years presenting to the board on the progress. You kind of are in and out, and so you might not mind putting more of the risk on the back end.
Right. That makes sense. Then That makes a lot of sense. So you're getting more people intent, giving them an opportunity to really validate the model, really clarity about when things aren't lining up, and that you move on. But it's objective around it, so it's not like, hey, we got a bad gut feel and we're gonna change
That's right.
directions. When you have a seller that's the one that wants to run a process in confidentiality, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, run is a kind of nebulous word. I mean, it manifests itself in different ways. So it's not impossible. Certainly, if you're aligned uh, with, there's uniform integrity throughout all parties. Everyone's above board, and however big the tent is, there's information sharing, so you know each other stands. That is a really good foundation, even if you don't own as much as you would like. But at the end of the day, you really got to, I hate to put like financial fiduciary hat on, but you're really accountable to those folks. So it's it's a matter of not succumbing to the romance of doing that deal, the kind of things you alluded to and described a moment ago, and being able to say, hey, look, um, we haven't been able to dot our I's and cross our T's and diligence. I won't name any of the deals, but there's some that, you know, former employers of mine and others have done that ended up with really uh, bad headlines. And that can happen when you're perhaps romanced by a certain theoretical competitive advantage or a certain piece of technology that will separate you, and you really want to get your hands on that. And it perhaps hasn't even been fully vetted, so you can easily kind of stretch the synergistic value you can justify in the model because of it, because it's lesser known. But at the end of the day, you've got to be able to do all those things on like a diligence checklist, et cetera, to make sure you're happy with it. Otherwise, you have to. It's really difficult. You might have pressure from a board of directors, whomever, to make sure a deal gets done. But if you're not just a service provider, you're going to be the one. Well, even if you are a service provider, I guess in some situations, you're going to be accountable for getting into a bad deal. So you really got to think of your fiduciary responsibility first and foremost.
But at the end of the day, though, diligence needs to get done. Um,
And it's got to get done according to the parameters that don't change, simply because there's a shiny object here, and I don't know, there's an aspect of the shiny object that folks don't want to share. And they've got a number of other bidders out there. You don't want to lose to the competition. You can imagine these scenarios. They exist every day, all the time. But you've got to be able to sleep at night knowing that you either did, in which case it did that diligence, in which case you can go ahead and do the deal, or not do the diligence, in which case you should feel comfortable walking away and being able to justify that to those to whom you're accountable.
that sounds like the challenge of today's market, especially if you're going through a bank process. It's extremely competitive, aggressive.
Absolutely.
It's a
Absolutely.
tough one.
Yeah. And thankfully, some of those are aggressive with, obviously, I won't call it perfect information, but with an open sharing environment where you can make decisions about who's into the tent, make sure you have proper legal coverage, non-disclosure agreements and the like for those parties who are. So you're at least covered from a legal standpoint, and then go ahead and do it. It's competitive today, even if you have those conditions, but certainly if there's um, not full disclosure, for lack of for using a legal term in a colloquial way, then I think you've got to question whether the deals we're doing.
Sounds like a good approach. Make sure at the end of the day that you get the level of comfortability you need and did the proper diligence
Absolutely.
to do go move into it. What's the biggest mistake you've seen made during integration?
This manifests itself in a number of different ways, but insufficient attention paid to creating an organizational commitment to making the deal a success is probably the biggest hurdle. So to paint a picture, You've had an excellent diligence process. You're very confident in your model, and then you're extracting certainly at least a fair share of the total deal value generated. And I hate to keep going back to this because it's not the only reason. But let's say, it's a small group of folks, and the people, if this is a deal where you're going to integrate it into a larger or existing organization, and you don't, it's thought of as your deal. So you're the M&A girls or guys, and you're throwing an asset to someone who's running a business saying, hey, this is a great deal. We got this for X, whatever, have at it. If those folks haven't been involved, and involvement isn't the only indicator of organizational commitment, but those folks haven't been involved, then there's a better than average chance that they're not going to be committed to it. And so without that commitment, I mean, if you think about it, depending on how organizations are organized, if you have in an enterprise folks who have their day jobs, and then they're also called upon to integrate an existing business, which happens to some degree in just about any deal, even if you have some dedicated resources. But if they're not really gung-ho on this really making the company better and identifying their individual role and the relationship between that and this better strategic outcome for the company, then burning the midnight oil to make this deal work for someone else in M&A that threw it at me when I've already got my plate full with the day-to-day now, I don't know if I'm going there. Whereas if up front we have that kind of commitment that we're all going to row in the same direction to make this happen, and it almost always takes extra bandwidth to do that, then you got a way better chance. So it's that organizational commitment, or the lack thereof, is the overlooking the need for organizational commitment is the single biggest mistake that I've seen made, and why most deals fail to deliver the value they seek.
This is a good one. Stakeholder alignment needs to happen early.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to some of these there's a thread through there. If we've got a change management plan, if we're analyzing the stakeholders, who's likely to be gung-ho about this deal, maybe it's creating a career opportunity for them that they didn't have, who is most likely to be reluctant to embrace the deal, maybe because there's something about that deal that might be adopted, or that business that diminishes their current role, whatever that is. You really need to analyze that, and not just at the very top, but maybe a level below, to understand that and really do a job. They always say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's really part and parcel to making sure the culture's there. So it's not only about the acquirers who have to make sure they buy into the deal, but it's everyone who's been acquired, to the extent you're maintaining, and it always, the profile changes with each deal, but how many of those folks you're counting on as pivotal actors in the go forward company, that they stay on, et cetera, et cetera. You're accounting for cultural differences. What the end state is in terms of culture. So all those things play a role in determining the level of organizational commitment.
It sounds like there's this M&A preparation that could never happen too early, where almost this sort of identifying or getting stakeholders involved can even happen before you identify the target company in a way.
Yeah, and I'll admit, look, culture has to happen all the way down, and you can't have everybody in the tent. I mean, that's not really efficient, not realistic. But at least on those levels, you can account for everyone in the planning. So you probably don't want, or you won't have, everyone involved in the actual deal process. But hopefully those who are involved are thinking of the implications, at least the material implications, which tend to happen higher up in the org chart, that you need to account for. That'll have a big impact on whether or not success is achieved. So at least have them thought about in planning, even if it's not realistic to have them all kind of included in the detailed deal making, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. What other problems do we come across in integration?
One of the things, my pet peeves is a lack of agreed upon measure of success. So in most larger transformational deals, you'll have, uh, if they're well run, you'll have business cases, maybe by business process or by function, where you're going to achieve synergies, cost synergies, growth synergies, you name it, the costs associated with integration, et cetera, et cetera. But if we don't agree upon how we're going to measure success, and it's not just like, well, profitability or some well established financial statement measure. It's literally about how you build that up. So inevitably, if you are truly integrating something that's acquired, then determining its impact in isolation is inherently difficult, right? I'm going to merge all my systems. I'm going to merge all my business processes. So then how do I determine the value of what I acquired when my goal is, in fact, to just make it part of one unified organization, right? So, in other words, your overarching goal works against measuring in isolation. So that's just kind of a known M&A dilemma. But what you can do is to establish what those measures are going to be, knowing that they're never going to be perfect, knowing that you can always shoot holes in them. But just say, hey, look, we're going to make them as simple as possible, make them directionally representative. They're never going to be perfect, but directionally representative. And then communicate it so everybody's on the same page. Yeah, this measure isn't perfect. Yeah, it doesn't have this or that, but you know what it is. You know how to calculate it. And we're agreed that that's how we're going to measure ourselves. So the devil's in the details of that one. So it's not like people don't say, hey, we need to have an ROI of X. Yeah, everybody does that. So it's not that highest level measure. It's really how are you building that up that at like a business case level. That's where the devil is in the details. And so that's where if you don't establish that up front and it's everybody man or woman for themselves, you know how we can all manipulate numbers to get to where we want to go.
Do you have some examples of what these success measures are? Because I feel like when I talk to integration folks, there's a lot around milestones, and here's sort of milestones that are set up, but not so much success metrics.
Well, I tend to think of things in financial terms. So in many cases, it's dollars and cents. But of course, those are the lagging indicators. Of course, there are some leading that are probably more qualitative around organizational, org design, org structure. But when you think about it, so those things that are related to cost, and in some cases even growth, to have a baseline for what the acquired businesses look like. And in many cases, not changing that. So in other words, agreeing on a baseline book of business, agreeing on a baseline level of cost, and then assigning some factor for measuring for considering the impact of the overall trend in cost or growth made by that acquired piece of business. So if that's on the growth side, you've got a book of business of X, the overall business post close grows by Y percentage, and you're going to assign 0.2 of Y of that growth rate to this particular book of business as a way to determine what the growth was for that. Or if there's a factor of, hey, it's let's say a certain percentage assigned to that unique homogeneous book of new business, and then maybe there's some synergy there on the growth side. So a smaller percentage of the overall growth of the non-acquired growth will also be attributed to it. So it's much easier shown on paper because it doesn't sound as simple when I talk about it, but it's really about 2 or 3 calculations, and you're repeating that reporting period after reporting period to really measure the growth.
This is a good example. And I can see that fluctuate quite a bit depending on the deal and the strategy itself. Because you have a different purpose of doing the deal, then obviously those metrics are going to be completely shifted.
Exactly right. So this is kind of what we'll say a generic ambition that we're going to build. We're going to integrate Target into this existing business, and it's going to flourish even more than it had before because it can leverage whatever we currently have, and that can also have an ancillary benefit to that existing business. And just coming up with a simple mathematical formula for both and keeping that static.
How did you see the integration approach evolve over the years? What are some things you've done to improve?
So it hopefully follows logically with where I've seen some of the problems. Um, but I think creating dedicated resources is in a large organization is one of the best ways to be able to help ensure. It doesn't guarantee anything, but help ensure you're going to realize that deal value. And this, of course, is where deal flow justifies it, right? So if you've got folks who are dedicated across the deal continuum, from diligence to integration, they get to know your business. And although you can always find wonderful service providers and you can use those service providers deal after deal, you may not always have the same folks, even if you're using the same firm. But what you have here with dedicated resources is you get tribal knowledge of not only doing a deal, but being around long-term for integration. You need to probably resource it at a level that is below what needs are in peak levels to be able to maintain those folks. So you're not constantly adjusting your resources. But if you have it somewhere below the peak, maybe a midpoint below the peak, that way you can always maintain those resources as deal flow cyclically rises. Then you can always supplement it with outside service providers. And then as deal flow subsides, you can still maintain a healthy pipe for those folks who are still around. But what it enables you to do is to not sacrifice your current business. You know, there's a real pattern in M&A when folks who are necessary to make an acquisition really survive, you're typically going to pull some good people to make that happen. Well, when you do that, typically what happens is you've got the current book of business suffering, or you get burnout, or both. And so by doing a number of deals and having an expertise in some part of the deal continuum, you're going to build knowledge about your business, about how deals work inside your business, and you're going to have continuity from deal to deal. So not only does that allow the fundamentals of the deal process to work well, but it also gives you the chance that integration happens much better and much more successfully than it otherwise would. And the bottom line is too, it's not the top consideration, but it can end up saving you money in terms of your integration or diligence resources that you might otherwise have to spend if you're constantly going to service providers.
These are really good reasons. I like the tribal knowledge. I think that's a really good point because if you're shifting outside resources, those people shift and you don't retain it, which also sort of inhibits you from developing that real M&A expertise. I liked your point about alleviating some of the burden on your business itself so they can stay focused on the goals and operations, and then overall increasing probability of success and may potentially even save some costs at that as well.
Yeah, and it, you know, I have to preface it all by saying you need to have some level of deal flow. Like if you're doing deals in a very one-off fashion, then that approach won't be for you. There's got to be some level there that justifies making those investments. But yeah.
Well, and then probably it's a real core part of the strategy. Hey, we're
That's right.
going to, at the minimum, do one deal, but maybe multiple deals throughout the year.
That's right. We've got inorganic growth as a real cornerstone of, it's going to give us X% of our total growth. And we think our total growth is going to be 2 or 3X, whatever those numbers happen to be. And therefore, it's worth the investment.
What does that look like as you start building out those dedicated resources? Because I assume you've obviously got the front end deal folk, and then
Yeah.
you'll get an integration leader, or essentially somebody with the knack of managing integration. Um, and then how does it expand from there? Do you keep tacking more people in the group? Do you start looking for operational expertise within each function and having them as a dedicated resource? Like, what does that evolution curve look like?
Yeah, there's a little bit. I think you hit upon most of the areas. There's a little bit of that. So you'll have team that would be involved in traditional M&A functions. So certainly the front end of the deal continuum before you get to integration. Like I said, the resources you'll have dedicated to that. If you've got, hopefully, again, you're doing strategic planning. If you're a larger organization that is somewhat sophisticated, you may be doing an LRP, long range plan, 2 or 3 years long. You say, hey, this is what the organic growth profile looks like. We're going to hire against the 40% of that deal flow, knowing that I'd rather err on the side of having a little bit too few people than risk having to lose people. I can always supplement my needs with the service provider. So you've got that in a core team. And then, as you mentioned, doesn't have to be every function, but think about those that have the largest impact. I'm sure most folks can quickly come up with, and whether it's function or business process, I should say, I feel like function is often a somewhat dated way to think about things as opposed to business process. But however the org is designed, however your enterprise is designed, to kind of emulate that. But areas that are obvious it would be in terms of your legal representation. So some in-house counsel that's skilled in deal making, obviously in human resources as well. There are plenty of issues with respect to acquired employees, et cetera, et cetera. And they are often, it's a mistake. Too many organizations put it all on them, but they certainly are key players in cultural adaptation. So the whole concept I mentioned before of having organizational commitment, HR plays a key role there. You've obviously want to have folks in various other operations. So if you're a manufacturer, if you're a distributor, you want supply chain. If you're a manufacturer, you probably want those areas at least at a high level represented. Does every function have to be in there? Do you need an M&A expert in I don't know, treasury? I don't want to pick on other organizations. You probably can have someone who may work on all your deals, but the bandwidth needed is small enough to where it can just be a percentage of their current role, rather than something that they need to be dedicated. And that's still a way to build organizational muscle around M&A.
It's a lot to cover, but it makes a lot of sense in terms of basically mimicking what your organization looks like and the weight that you have. If you're a very tech forward company, that's a big emphasis of your acquisitions, and sort of mirroring that, and then building it along around the priorities as well as you described.
Yeah. So in the tech context, if you don't have product development dedication there, you probably should, because that's going to be a key part of diligence integration, where you see a given, say, platform developing in the future, et cetera.
Since being at Salesforce, you started a new chapter of your career. What does your current role entail?
So current role, I'm a business value advisor. So essentially, I help our customers identify and realize the value they receive from their investment in our platform.
And so, can you give me maybe an example of what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So at the end of the day, folks will make investments, and like many technology investments, there's a whole lot of functionality that can be deployed. Salesforce is no different. And so customers will often want to quantify the impact that a given investment has on the value that's created at large. So we tend to think about things in terms of enterprise value that's created, not value related to a given product or solution that we might deliver. So we tend to, if you think about this, from a strategic standpoint. Just like M&A, I always say is probably the most explicit manifestation of corporate strategy, simply because, particularly for public companies, you're telling the street how great this deal is. You almost always, if it's of a certain size, have the C-suite involved, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just one leg of a potential strategy for an enterprise. You could have plenty of organic growth strategies, other markets you'd like to tap, et cetera, et cetera. So what we'd like to do is get an understanding for what your strategic goals are. And then particularly as Salesforce has grown over the years, there's such a wealth of functionality in the platform that typically you can align to some of the performance indicators. So in many cases, these are the leading indicators that have a relationship to ultimately whether or not you achieve those goals. So we help our customers identify the relationship between their overall goals and some of the indicators that we can help drive that have an impact on whether or not they achieve those goals.
So you're making sure there's some ROI there.
Absolutely. No doubt about it. And in some cases, though, that's a real explicit exercise with the customer. In other cases, that is both a qualitative, quantitative, and anecdotal exercise. It really depends on where the customer's at in terms of their ability to measure some of these indicators and their ability to act upon what those indicators tell them in order to have an impact on strategic outcomes.
And then even M&A could fall into that.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. So when I talk to a customer about what your strategic values are or strategic objectives are, you're bound to have, should say bound to, you will probably have both what we'll call organic and inorganic goals among them, even for your growth. And you probably got maybe other organizational goals that are not as rigorous quantitatively, but M&A certainly can fit into that.
What are common challenges of assessing value realization?
The biggest challenge are establishing measurement mechanisms with customers. So first, the customer needs to agree upon what measures are really good indicators of value. And if you can establish a powerful leading indicator, as most folks who deal in these things realize, that you provide yourself with a really powerful tool to affect the outcome. So if you see an indicator trending in a way that's not favorable, you've got some time before the rubber has met the road in order to make sure you can course correct to try to achieve your objective. But the only way you can do that is if you're actually measuring it. And the more rigorously you're measuring your indicators, the better. Sometimes these indicators will be at a fairly granular level. So at an activity-based level, activity-based of employees. And so if you don't have ways to measure those, and again, with measures, it's kind of like we mentioned about evaluating deal success. It's better to have a well understood, well communicated, and something that you can track easily enough as an indicator rather than something that's absolutely perfect. But to the extent customers have those measurement mechanisms in place, they have a much greater chance at not only measuring the value being received, but having an impact on the eventual value realized. But we see that many customers, for various reasons, it's not always a matter of capability. In many cases, it's a matter of bandwidth and priority without the measurement mechanisms in place to really provide themselves with a level of confidence that they can sleep on.
How are you getting visibility in this data? I mean, are you wiring some BI tools together and automating?
It really depends on first what those strategic goals are, and then what those indicators might be. In many cases, in the context of Salesforce and other technology companies, data can be had strictly from the platform itself. In other cases, you may have an indirect impact on a customer's goal. In other words, your particular technology may be have an indirect impact on it. There may be other things within the customer's business that have more direct, but in any case, you still have an impact, and those might be measured outside of the platform, in which case you need to rely more on the customer. But even if it can be measured within a given platform, it doesn't mean it is. I forget some of the statistics, but even with respect to not enterprise software, but with respect to like user software, what percent of functionality do people use in even common software tools? It's always a minuscule amount. Well, the same can be said about enterprises with enterprise software. And so it's beholden to the not only the partner, but the customer themselves to make a commitment to really leverage that functionality in order to be able to provide those measures. And that's part of what we do in business value, is to make sure the customer understands the potential. Here's what it could look like, because we kind of paint a mosaic prospectively first, and then hopefully that's a good enough selling tool so that the customer will invest the bandwidth, the mind share into not only selecting the right indicators, but the mechanisms to measure them.
Yeah, that's really unique, and a lot of variables to map out for every unique organization.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. But those who make that commitment really don't have to wonder or take wild guesses as to whether or not they're really getting bang for their buck. They've got a really good understanding based upon agreed upon attribution and the like about what they're getting out of their investment.
We covered a lot of lessons today. I'm looking at my notes. We talked about early planning for integration, talked about keeping the tent wide open, getting stakeholders involved early. We talked about essentially utilizing those stakeholders to validate your model and keeping it very objective so you know when to walk away. We talked about creating some metrics to measure success, how eventually you should think about having a dedicated resources to make sure you can have more successful deals and that tribal knowledge and the other benefits. Anything else we're missing in terms of key lessons for M&A practitioners tuning in?
I just mentioned it once, and it's not the least bit profound, and everybody knows it, but it's always still elusive, and that's that culture does eat strategy for breakfast. So that creating, particularly if you're talking about an acquired asset that has a different culture, either maybe you want to adopt that culture in your existing organization, or vice versa, or maybe something new. You can't overestimate that. And since it's a little less easy to objectively measure, it's still a big hurdle that most organizations face. But that's, I guess, the only thing that I would reiterate, that's the real nut to crack.
I feel like we could have a whole roundtable discussion about it, because everybody's got such varying views, from cultures don't align, don't do the deal at all, versus, hey, you just need to acknowledge the difference and be really open about it and sort of address the issues as they come up and map or build towards a common culture. A lot of different ways of looking at it. So I'm kind of curious if there's a certain approach or a way of thinking that you default to.
Yeah, I think I always come back to, what are the strategic objectives of this deal? I mean, you could have, a Berkshire Hathaway approach, which I don't care if the companies are vastly different, might not even be in a similar part of the portfolio. So in that case, hey, whatever's working, assume it's a worthwhile asset, you're buying it in the first place, then let it go and let it do well. If it's full on, like this is going to be completely absorbed, then I think either of those two approaches you mentioned can work. You've got to mention in that latter scenario that you've got that planned out and that it's not taking 3 or 4 years. It's the time value of money at the end of the day. If I've delayed what's crucial sufficiently, I'm never going to make that up in the deal value. I'm never going to make it up. So I think you should heed large cultural differences and consider whether you should do the deal like you mentioned first. But that it's not that second option isn't doable. You just need a plan, particularly the timelines around that plan, and need to make sure you hit them. Otherwise, if it's still 5 years and you're working to see what that common culture looks like, you've already lost.
Fair point. Mike, what's the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
So I love this one. Keeson, for everyone else benefit, you maybe asked this to everybody, but so you send me some questions in advance. And I, for whatever my humble opinion's worth, it's a great question. Now, I don't have like the most awesome story, maybe some things I probably can't share even over podcasts, but I was mentioned, I jotted something down with respect to a particular deal where there was some trying circumstances not related to the deal itself. I think back to some of the things like aliases people would create when we're going to do diligence at certain places, and kind of like faux identities on how that used to work in a pre-LinkedIn age. And now if you say your name, but give yourself some other title from some other place, they'll find you out on LinkedIn in 2 seconds. But the one thing I remembered was going to do a deal in like not quite near the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but northern Michigan in like the middle of the winter. I don't know. We get in there at nighttime, meaning anytime after like 4 p.m. And it's like crazy blizzard. I mean, you're in this small, I don't know, 20, 30 seater jet. I don't know how this thing lands, this plane, but somehow it gets on the ground. And, in between like all the thankful prayers I'm saying, I find out that it's just not a little bit of snow. There's like this blizzard. And of course, the target's like a couple hours away from there, in roads like with no streetlights, whatever. And then I find out like I'm the guy who has to drive that thing. So it turned out that the flight was the piece of cake. And it's literally like white knuckle driving for 2 hours on a road that isn't lit with probably about 10 feet of visibility, all trying to get to this place. We finally end up making it there in one piece after nearly sliding off road into like a 20-foot drop. But anyway, we go ahead and get into the diligence. You don't end up buying the darn company anyway. So life on the line.
You say you didn't buy the company?
No, we didn't end up doing a deal at the end of the day. So all around, I think we actually ended up making another trip there in less inclement weather. But in any case, kudos to the dedication of my colleagues who, well, first of all, they were foolish enough to have me as the driver. But thankfully I got us there in one piece anyway.
All in pursuit of the deal.
That's right.
A little risking your life here and there. It's all part of it.
That's right. And of course, we don't do it anyway. So.
Oh, hi, Mike. I really appreciate your time. I enjoyed this conversation and appreciate you sharing the lessons.
No, I did as well. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you. And here's to the deal.